Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for your patience. We were working through just a few uh, alignment opportunities here, but we're really, really glad that you could make it this morning and join us today. I'm Sarah Becerra, the Interim Chief Program Officer for Prosperity Now. And before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank you for the work you do on the ground every day. Housing counseling, local lending, and community-based support are where these issues show up first and most clearly, and this conversation is very much informed by that reality. Today's session draws from a new white paper co-authored by Prosperity Now, Nestment, and Next Belt Strategies. We'll walk through what the research surfaced and leave time for reflection and questions toward the end of today's hour together. A few notes on housekeeping as we go. This session is being recorded and will be shared after our time together in case for those that are unable to make it, and also for those that want to share and be able to reference the sharings and observations today. Please use the chat throughout our session to share questions, observations. We'll have some space throughout for engagement opportunities and Q&A. We'll hold space for discussion near the end, so you don't have to wait until the final moments to start thinking about what this conversation brings up for you in your work as a practitioner or from whatever vantage point you're coming in from. We wanted to start with a quick understanding of how your work engages in this area today. So in a moment, you'll see a Zoom poll pop up, and we'd love to get your take on this question around what are you seeing in terms of primary challenges first-time buyers are seeing. We're going to launch the poll now. You should see it on your screen with those options, both on the presentation as well as directly in the poll. Choose the best one. What are you seeing most frequently, most often? We'll give everyone a moment to respond and share what we're seeing collectively. Lots of responses coming in. We'll take another 10 seconds or so for everyone to respond. 5, 4, 3, 2, and let's see where we landed here. So overwhelmingly, almost half of us in the room are seeing that the number one challenge is finding housing that fits their budget and needs. We see saving enough for a down payment being second, 20%, and then a little bit of a breakdown between the other options, competing with cash buyers, not as much, and about 10%, 12% of us don't work directly with first-time home buyers, but maybe you're seeing different trends, challenges, patterns when it comes to first-time home buying. And that is what I was just explaining, and now you can see it on the screen. So that 48% finding housing that fits budget and needs, saving enough for down payment as our second. And we'll share these results too, so you can have that on hand and just understand what is the current scope of challenge for first-time buyers. So with that little bit of insight, it really feeds well into the conversation we're having today. What are you seeing in your regions, in your areas, and what are the trends that are happening overall? So I wanted to share a bit about who our presenters are today and the co-authors of the white paper that we'll be releasing soon. Chrissy Johnson is our Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer with Prosperity Now. I'll be passing it over to her in just a moment to give a little more context on today's conversation. We've got Jeremy Potter, who's the co-host of Insiders podcast and principal of Next Belt Strategies, another co-author of the forthcoming white paper. Thank you for being here, Jeremy. And Niles Lichtenstein, who's the co-founder and CEO of Nestment. Thank you, Niles, for being here. We'll hear from both of you in just a little bit. And for now, I would love to pass it over to Chrissy to share a little bit more about why this conversation matters now and how we'll be moving through some of these key findings through today's webinar. So Chrissy, I will pass it to you and I will manage the slides as you go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah, for pulling this all together. And I really want to echo appreciation for everyone on this call. This research really came together because of what we kept hearing from people like you across housing counseling, across lending and community-based work. It really is wonderful when we start to compare notes and see things match up and align across those areas. Over the past few years, we've really been seeing increasingly consistent signals from different angles. Counseling organizations were telling us that buyers were getting stuck earlier, disengaging more often. Lenders were seeing strong applicants, but couldn't get them approved and couldn't get them, or they could get them approved, but they couldn't get them to closing. And the market data really kept reinforcing that pattern. And that led us to this shared question, which is why are so many prepared first-time buyers stalling or stepping away before purchase, even when they appear to be qualified on paper? So today is about that question. It's not that question. It's not about prescribing solutions or telling anyone how to do their work differently. Instead, the goal is really to look at how buyers are experiencing the system right now and to put shared language around patterns that many of you are already encountering in practice. This is a synthesis conversation. And we're trying to name what is happening, not rush to fix it. And so let me start this off by turning over to Jeremy to really ground us in how the starter home, RIP, when you read the white paper, has historically functioned and what has changed today.
Yeah, we thank you, Chrissy, and thanks for having me here to talk about this research that we did. Just comes out at such a great time with a bunch of converging trends and much of what we just saw in the poll. How do we find the right house to enter the market? If I'm a renter today, what am I seeing? What am I experiencing? And of course, we'll talk a little bit. Niles will frame up what they're feeling as well. I think everyone watching this probably knows and has worked with first-time homebuyers to know exactly how it feels. And maybe you have been that first-time homebuyer as well. You know, when we said that the starter home is dead, of course, there is always the story of the one-off in this market or the one-off in this market. I'm based in Detroit, Michigan, so we could still find probably a unit here that might fall into the category for people that don't live here as the quote unquote starter home. But constructively, we've seen that the entry point for the square footage and the price point that a first-time home buyer is looking for is unavailable in almost every market, if not every market in America. And so as a result, the housing continuum, the housing step up that we're used to, that actually the industry has relied on for a long time, has kind of been broken. So we're all familiar with what Chrissy mentioned as the historical context of getting in that first house. It meets the needs of a starter home because of family size and income. As income grows, as family grows, typically square footage and house size grows. And you use the equity from the starter home to feed the down payment or the investment in the larger home. And there, like I said earlier, there's a continuum, there's a ladder. And then at some point there's downsizing, which recycles some of those houses through. And what we're finding and what we're hearing from first-time home buyers is not only are there units that don't meet the square footage or size hopes, there's also no price point left for what they would consider to be their starter home. This is even in the face of people saving more money and waiting longer to buy a home, even counting that they're not able to find a home that they need. There's been also, you heard me mention a convergence of trends. Some of those trends are supply side and some are demand side. But let me talk for a second about the supply side. You've all probably heard and are very familiar with the fact that builders are not building in the 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 square foot homes, largely because the cost of land, the cost of labor, regulatory compliance, and other types of um, uh, fees make the cost stack so that if you're going to buy land, it pencils out that you're going to maximize the footprint and maximize the list price for that house. Okay, so then we turned and looked at smaller square footage units, duplexes, townhouses, condos. Maybe they're the answer. And about 5 or 10 years ago, the GSEs started looking at condo financing. Could that be a way? Maybe if I can't get into a home, I can get into a unit and start earning equity. Well, it turns out, as we studied that research for the last 10 years, condos did not come in at a below single family home market rate. Turned out condos were built either in luxury areas or sustained a monthly payment, a list price and a monthly payment that put them out of reach, honestly, for a lot of first time home buyers. So whether you look at this, convergence of trends and call it a size problem, a price problem, we definitely know that it has eliminated the opportunity in most markets for a lot of first time home buyers. If what they're looking for is that traditional starter home. So they started to turn to a couple of different options. And we want to get into some of the ways in which the mentality of shoppers has changed how they look at the market. But the point that I think you'll hear today that's really exciting to me is we don't have shoppers who cannot qualify for the traditional starter home or cannot qualify for a home. Actually, what we have is a cohort of first-time home buyers who can qualify. They're just looking for something to spend their money on. They're looking for something to actually put their available credit from their lender, from hopefully some of you listening on this call, put that to work in the market. And so that's really where we'll focus is now that the starter home is constructively unavailable, how do we think about that market? How do we think about getting square footage and units and equity into the hands of first-time homebuyers to get them started on a housing continuum? That housing continuum might look a little different, but we think we can adapt and respond.
Thanks. Sorry, frog in my throat. Thank you, Jeremy. I do think it's helpful to that's so helpful to ground us, like I said, in the history and really what you're talking about here that I heard are some talking about something that worked until it didn't, and that there were some serious assumptions that were baked into what the original intent of the starter home was. Can you give us a little more nuance on what some of those assumptions were that were baked into that starter home model, and really why some of those assumptions, or what should those assumptions honestly feel most out of sync with today's buyers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to think about this is the assumption that you need 20% down really got challenged by conventional lending and said, okay, we're going to provide programs where you need less than 20% down. So the first thing that sort of the traditional model did was it added avenues at slightly higher costs to be able to get in at less than 20% down. As soon as that happened, it unlocked the demand that made the assumption for a lot of people that they could move from largely a smaller rental unit in a highly dense building or area into their own home. So for the first kind of traditional starter home mentality, Chrissy, it was a single family home. That was the focus of the traditional starter home. I think the other thing that we know is home prices were such that you could count on that starter home leading to something else. You didn't have to go in assuming that that first home, your first keys, were your final home or your forever home. So that was the other kind of baseline assumption most buyers made. They did not actually expect to be there for 30 years. And often you would hear at that time I'm gonna, we're here now, we're looking for our forever home, which was the more traditional concept of the family home. So those two things I can get in at slightly less from a financing barrier, even if it costs me a little more on insurance or some other things, rate. And this home is not I don't need this to be everything for me. It can be known to be just the first starting point. And I think those two pieces of mentality, what we saw, especially with new builds, was new builds started to kind of attack that mentality. A bigger square footage home on a bigger lot for a wealthier first time home buyer suddenly became a different type of home in their mind. Now, maybe I don't know, maybe I will stay here 30 years. So that kind of mentality change was actually an interesting structural change too, for buyers and in the market. And then lastly, we've always had, and this hasn't changed, that home ownership is considered to be a valuable asset for the community. And it's always been so. Starter homes were seen as tying people to the community, even though it wasn't their forever home. We know that, especially historically, many people didn't move that far when they did move, when they found a larger house. We saw a lot of trends historically where people would stay nearby or in the community, but just move to a larger house. Again, that structural model was supported, and that's how real estate agents drummed up their business. It's how those very localized real estate markets that we are familiar with, the real estate agent, the mortgage lender, the title agent, all working on a bunch of deals together over time, going back to your real estate agent over time for multiple deals. That's because geographically you stayed relatively close as you moved up this continuum, and we're not seeing that anymore, because if I can't get in, then I have to look elsewhere. I have to move. I have to think differently. So the concepts of the structural market as well as the perception changing off of that have really made it so that we don't have the same approach. We have new, different approaches, and we don't have that same, community aspect that we're going to talk about bringing back.
Yeah, and it really creates a juxtaposition here that in the next slide, I loved seeing this data that was pulled together from the study that showed really how jarring it is, how things have shifted just in the past few decades, honestly, where you see the difference in median income pretty much staying very, very close in this study, and the median home price going like that hockey stick type trajectory moving up, and that's causing that friction there, that misalignment between the structural challenges and then what's happening in real life. So this framing really helps explain why this feels really like less like a temporary disruption, as you can see here, and more like a structural shift. And I do want to build on that by talking about who's today's first time buyer is actually based on the data, and give some context there, and then turn it over to Niles. So when we really look at who is entering the first time buyer pipeline today, there are a few things that stand out. Millennials and Gen Z now make up the majority of first time buyers. That is not surprising. And many of them really have strong credit profiles and stable income. It's not about expanding approvals or pushing marginal borrowers into ownership. This is about people who are mortgage eligible and ready to buy a home. It's just the structures have not adapted to them. This large cohort of buyers just can't, they're qualified, they can't transact under current conditions. And then with that, there's the repeated friction of being outcompeted by cash buyers or not understanding viable pathways. That leads to disengagement. And you're going to see this on the next slide with some of the issues that they're facing. Over that time, this disengagement really becomes a loss of trust in the market and a loss of trust in the process, and not just delay, it stops them. And that matters beyond housing, because delayed ownership, we know this through history, affects household stability, community stability, family formation, and local economic participation. The economic ripple effects into the community and beyond can be seen in how people and how they invest in their home affects how they invest in the rest of the economy. And so to really understand where that friction shows up, I want to turn to Niles here, who can speak about what navigation looks like in real buyer journeys that he works with.
Yeah, thank you all for, and I think two data points that you've covered in the slides that I think really hit home and hit different in a different way was when you showed that first one, that 40 is now the first time median buying age, right? It was 38 last year, which was higher than it's ever been, ever, right? But when people saw 40 in November of this year with the National Association of Realtors, NAR research, it definitely hit different. And I think what was fascinating is if you charted it back 30 years before that, it would hover for decades between 28 to 30 or 31, right? There are little blips along the way, but progressively has gotten higher and higher. And I bring that up because it represents the mentality of the first time buyer. And as we said kind of yesterday when we were all talking, the desire is very much there, but we're now seeing this huge gap between from desire turning into demand, which where it can be actually be transacted into the market place, into a real kind of buy side, demand side marketplace. So pricing is huge, right? So if you think about the notion of a 20% down payment, which now we're talking about how it's become lower and lower, which is necessary. It's hard to make that work when 80% of your salary is required for a 20% down payment, right? And 30% of that is going towards rent, right? So the math doesn't actually math for a lot of our folks. And so what we've seen over the past, especially last 2 years, is not only a decline in total homeownership, but a marked decline in the percentage of first-time home buyers. So typically in the economy, we would see, somewhere around 5 million homes being sold or purchased every year, of which 31 to 36% would be first-time home buyers. That was a consistent. Now we'd love for more first-time home buyers to be part of that. Actually, 2 years in 2024 will go to 24, lowest it's ever been since the metric was recorded, and then now it's 21%, right? And just to share what that drop represents, that's over 700,000 buyers, right? So we're literally saying that just dropped out of the funnel. Now, the point that you brought up earlier was a very important one. These are not people that all of a sudden, if 700,000 people, potential buyers, all of a sudden just didn't have jobs, that would be a much bigger issue. But no, these are people with strong credit. These are people with, good, steady and stable income, right? But they're not. So what we're talking about, right? There's a lot of things we want to solve for, but I think the first and most pressing issue for us is to solve this gap of 700,000 who are literally just marginally close, but that feeling, I will tell you from being in the trenches, working, and I know we'll talk through different case studies of real people and real humans and being there with folks. Even if you're 1% off, it still feels like an impossibility if you keep on trying, right? And I know we'll go into some of those stories when we go into different pathways. And so after a couple failed attempts, you get a lot of discouragement. You get a lot of feeling like the goalposts are being moved. This is not for them. And they start to settle into a mentality that we just have to sign another lease. And it keeps on happening to the point that we are in the position that we are now with a 21% of homes this past year were first-time home buyers rather than the typical average 10 years before of 33%.
Niles, I love hearing about these numbers. You referenced in our report that will be coming out on our website, prosperitynow.org, that we do have some case studies that we share for each of these opportunities. And I loved reading about them and found some points interesting and not surprising, but inspirational probably. And so I would love to hear from you since you've been in it with these people going through the journey. What did you see as the point when buyers most tend to stall, even when price and and eligibility is not the only issue. And then once you engaged them, what surprised you the most about those people who actually could afford a home once they did get support?
Yeah, I mean, we bucketed our folks into kind of two buckets. One was a lot of folks who didn't think they could afford, but they actually could. And I'll tell you, the most beautiful thing is when you are able to show with real dollars, when you meet someone where they are and you show them actually there is a pathway through, right? There's, whether it's a lower percent down with no PMI program or some of the alternative pathways we'll talk about. And then there's actually those who believe they can afford, but I'll take somebody like in our white paper, Cassandra Cordona, who was in the Bronx, and she was looking for 2 years with a lender and a realtor, and just it couldn't quite get there, and it felt like an impossibility. But after really spending a bit of that time and showing and actually showing the data, educating about what opportunities existed, she became a buyer in 2 months, right? And I feel like that's a really, and we see that a lot where people have, and we're not, at Nestment, we're focused on these market-based solutions for first-time homeowners. It's not like we can go through it and always be successful. We see those people who, for all intent and purposes, should be able to buy, right? But they aren't. But for a great majority of them, there is this feeling like I am overwhelmed, I am intimidated. Who is my partner in this journey, right? And how do I have that guidance? And what strategy am I going to take? So I know we'll talk more about that, but these are, real faces, real places, and I'm excited to talk about how that looks in practice.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing here, another thing that I just want to reinforce here is as we talk about different timelines that these borrowers have to navigate, and how it may conflict with some more traditional transaction-based systems. What I was seeing here, and I think what rose up from the paper was that navigation really is about like sequencing and clarity. It's not about replacing existing professionals. In fact, buyers often need that help earlier, before a transaction is imminent. And that's where the housing counselors, the coaches, and those who are involved in the process to help navigate these different pathways are going to be essential in doing this responsibly and safely as well.
Chrissy, I think, and I just want to add on to that point. Yes, in the housing counseling is so critical. And for Nestment, we look and are inspired by those models, and we created something called a home buying coach, right? And we use that term coach because part of our lives, it created a sense of accountability, but it became a non-threatening third party that was, armed with technology and tools and things for somebody to say, hey, whether it's 3 weeks, 3 months, or 3 years, right? Let's actually envision a destination. Let's create a path. So we created this 6-step path of understand you, show you what is possible, create some real examples of places that you might not have right now, but we will have at a certain point, or you could get to now just through these pathways. Make sure you have a team of agents, lenders that you feel comfortable with, right? People, I will say, and we love our agent and lender networks. And so we're just trying to be the orchestration layer. But sometimes, especially millennial and Gen Z buyers might feel intimidated by that interaction, right? And so it's really amazing when we get the opportunity to kind of work with, large brokerages and medium brokerages and agents and lenders to help bring people along that pathway and meet them where they are.
I love it. So let's get into the meat and potatoes, as my mother would say, of the research paper here. Niles and Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to divide and conquer as we go through some of these several ownership pathways briefly. The goal here, I just want to make sure we're framing, is not to advocate for any one approach, but to name patterns that we're already seeing in the market. These aren't fringe behaviors. People are doing these. These are practical responses to the current conditions that people are navigating. And each of these comes with different risks, different suitability to the consumer, and different regulatory considerations. It is a multifaceted opportunity that will require a multifaceted solution. And we want to talk about what's out there. And so we will go through now, Niles and Jeremy, if you can help me in describing the various pathways of co-buying, house hacking, rent vesting, and shared appreciation or shared equity, as well as cooperative communities. I believe we are starting with co-buying, Niles.
Yeah, and one last point before we jump into these. There was you'll see this in the white paper, but there was really fascinating data. We did something called NestGen, which was a home buying accelerator that we worked with Prosperity Now and others. 100% of the people, or nearly 100% of the people, came for these alternative pathways. But when we actually did the analysis and then showing in the buying numbers too, uh, about half of them were actually able to afford single family and condo, right? But they needed to be helped through that navigation process. The other 50% had to pursue kind of these other pathways, which we're going to talk about now. So I just want to start with that, which is like that feeling of impossibility becomes much more possible. And for about half of folks, let's take that 700,000 number, about half of them could probably, find a way to get to that in a responsible way. And then the other half, which is a huge amount, right, that we're talking about, are looking at these alternative pathways. So the first pathway is co-buying. And that really involves, 3 to 4 borrowers, typically folks who know each other, family and friends, jointly applying for a single mortgage with all parties legally obligated for the loan. So not many people, consumers, knew you could have up to 4 co-owners on a conventional mortgage. And, I will say, even within the lending structure, right? Sometimes loan officers were like, hey, I don't know if this will work on the back end. And then now I know we've gotten further along with that. But thankfully, the approach is, permitted under FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And all of a sudden, what we're starting to see is some really incredible pathways and everything from friends who've been renting together. So they've lived with each other and saying, hey, we're paying rent. Why don't we buy? To multi-generational folks coming together and living in that kind of communal setting and so forth, to even, finding a relative. I can't tell you how many times we've seen that there have been relatives who wanted to invest in their son, their daughter, their niece, their nephew, to help be a part of that process. And it's not like they're just gifting, but it's actually kind of an investment as well, and that they're going to be able to get a return. Now, why does this matter? It lowers the down payment. It allows for shared costs, and it distributes risk. So I would actually say, from what I'm seeing, it's less risky, especially for the types of folks who are coming together. You'll hear about an incredible story of Weldon and John, 2 friends who, graduated from a good college and had great engineering jobs. And they, for so long in the Bay Area, were looking to be able to buy their home. Finally, they were like, hey, we do so much together. We're in a band together. We do all these other things together. What if we looked and co-bought a multi-unit property? And they actually stacked, if you think about all the incentives, they were able to stack, multiple incentives. They co-bought together with them and their partners. They also house hacked, which I know we'll talk about, where they were able to get a 4-unit building. And they were able to use a Fannie program that allowed them to put less than around 6 or 7% down on that, and using the rental income. So very, very something that we're seeing about 1/3 of our buyers co-buying right now in of our first time buyers.
I believe the next one is house hacking
Oh yeah, we were just getting the
or shared equity.
shared
Jeremy.
equity. Go for it, Jeremy.
Yeah. So one of the things that we keep thinking about is this continuum of pathways, this flexibility of options. And so one of the ways we are approaching the idea of ownership, of asset creation or asset value, is if you can't get a house at the price point you want with the traditional model, what can you get in the market? What can you get started? If we think about this as an investment, any amount of equity that you can start creating is going to grow. And over time, that can be an additional leverage point to put towards a new investment or your next house. And so shared equity arrangements come in where platforms have raised money from investors who may otherwise deploy that in residential real estate some other way, buying a house and renting it out, a REIT model, which are all very familiar with. Sophisticated investors, Wall Street investors can get this exposure that way. And so shared equity platforms match up those types of investors with first-time home buyers such that they can use investor funds as their down payment to get to lower LTV lending. So 80, is the traditional one that most credit officers and banks and mortgage programs look to. Great. So upfront cash goes down because the investor contributes alongside the homeowner to get to that 20% or 30% down point. Also, it means that the responsibility on the homeowner for the monthly payment can be lower as well. You heard me mention earlier mortgage insurance. If you get to that 20 or 30% down, no mortgage insurance, monthly payment is lower as a result. And then you see that this gives homeowners a sense that there is a way in to the amount of home they can afford to get started. It doesn't affect the list price or the home values in the neighborhood. This isn't an artificial cap in any way on the home itself or the neighborhood. And finally, you have private capital taking a role alongside the individual in the market. So they're putting their capital up right next to individual capital to say, this is a good investment, and we think this will return future appreciation. And so for those reasons, it gives a homeowner flexibility to get in, flexibility monthly, likely. And then long-term, there's always the opportunity, if you like the house, these agreements, of course, everything's in the terms and conditions, so you have to be very careful. But a lot of these investments have out clauses at any time, all the way up to 10 years. So the homeowner, if they really want to, can buy that equity from the investor community at a set schedule, just like they would if they moved up to a bigger house, or just like they would with another type of investment. So what we are focusing on here are these platforms. So I just want to use one quick example. Homium is a residential real estate asset class now. It's a company that has decided they can take a whole bunch of these investments across all different types of homes and geographies. Michigan, Utah, higher cost markets tend to be where some of these places get started, but we've also seen them start in places like Detroit for middle income, missing middle housing as well. So they pool those together and they make that entire pool investable by investors. So investors like the diversity, and they like the fact that they get appreciation across America, across a bunch of different markets. And then that money can be used for first-time homebuyers to be able to buy that first house, whether it is in, like I said, California, Utah, or Michigan. And so companies like Homium are hoping that that will sit right next to a regular, more fixed income mortgage investment. But what it means for you is that there is a real market here. And that first mortgage, in many cases, is conventionally eligible for things like Fannie and Freddie. And then always, there is a non-agency portfolio market for those first lien mortgages as well. So a lot of times you'll hear shared equity or shared appreciation where somebody is trying to buy existing equity from a homeowner. What we think about those is that was just the tip of the market preparing investors to have exposure to this asset class. What I'm describing with Homium is slightly different in the sense that you're coming in alongside the home buyer at the moment they buy the home. And so the profile of that looks a little bit different. Fast forward though, all real estate equity could be put together in a secondary market that brings in even more investors. So those HELOC alternatives, those companies buying equity from existing homeowners, there's nothing to say someday there wouldn't be a market where they commingle those types of equities so all investors can jump in, pension funds, maybe even individual consumers on their Schwab account may someday invest in a residential real estate fund that is all of those types. Right now, it's still largely separate. but it is a growing market that is offering in private capital alongside people to get into those homes.
So I want to pause here, Jeremy, because what you are describing is shared equity at origination that results in shared appreciation over
That's right.
time. And that is a meaningful call out because a lot of these things, as we're going to be talking through rent vesting as well, we in the paper we do talk about market size and market opportunity. We also talk about the risks, both in how we need to navigate those risks and be aware of those risks, and also how these could possibly de-risk the market, both for the consumer and for the investor. And this is where I want to elevate that everything that we are talking about today, again, we're not advocating for any uh, explicit pathway, but we do advocate for ensuring that everything is done with intentionality, so as to avoid any unintended consequences that may be harmful to consumers that we work with. And this is why it is so critical that the housing counselors and other practitioners in the community are aware of these pathways and can differentiate the important uh, details that need to be in place, the guardrails that need to be in place when talking to consumers around disclosures, around how these ultimately turn into appreciation, so on and so forth. So as we're going through this, and as you sit with our white paper as well, we encourage you as practitioners to think about that and think about the communities you're working with and the questions that you receive and what may be helpful to you in navigating these possible opportunities and ensuring that we are supporting the appropriate risk appetite of the consumers that we're working with. So Jeremy and Niles, before I move on to the next, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think the last thing I would just mention is that as current events go, this is a way to push back on large institutional investors buying the entire house and renting it out, where now you can see them getting exposure to the market they want and new platforms being created to kind of align capital with home buyers as opposed to making them adversarial. Sorry, go ahead, Chrissy.
Wonderful. The next one is co-ops, cooperative communities. I believe, Jeremy, you also have this one.
Of course, we're all familiar with co-ops as a structure, especially for, urban density in places like New York City. We have them in Michigan. I'd like to start with an example, though, because I think the case study here is a better way to lead into the cooperative communities pathway. And that is a company called Frolic, based in the Pacific Northwest, working across Washington, Oregon, and California right now. But it looks something like this. Some single family home with a large lot and usually owned free and clear, but not necessarily by someone who has lived in the community and understands that it's time to move, but doesn't want to leave. They've actually targeted a bunch of different use cases where they turn those lots with aging homes into 6, 8, 10 unit cooperative communities on the same footprint. And now the previous homeowner gets one of those units and participates in the ownership 1/8, as well as what they cashed out for selling to Frolic. So imagine that we can take formerly single family home lots and turn them into co-owned and collective ownership communities across places that have made this possible. This means you get an ownership mentality. It means you get a community mentality. It does not usually threaten existing residents from high-rise buildings or even mid-rise buildings. Some of the other things that we've seen disrupt some land use conversations in certain cities. But that piece of the ownership means we're actually bringing down the overall cost to get in because we're creating more units out of that previous spot. And now I can buy in for what we believe is a relatively modest entry, what would be equivalent to a down payment. So that down payment gets you in, and then you start earning. And now you can decide from there. So obviously, access to the land, access to those parcels is part of why a company needs to exist. Find them, source them, and make this easy on potential homeowners. But we think it's a really interesting developing area for resident-owned communities and other types of development for cooperative communities.
Wonderful. We have two more. Let's move on to the next, I believe, is house hacking.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So about 35% of our buyers are house hackers. So about 50%, well, I would say actually 46% single family home found a way to get there. About 4 to 6% are single family home co-buy. So you'll hear about the Cardona sisters in Sacramento buying a townhouse there. And then the next biggest segment for us is around a third or so are what we call house hackers. And this usually goes with purchasing a 2 to 4 unit property. Now, remember, anything under 5 units, it can still be residential versus commercial, right? So 2 to 4 unit property, of which there's actually 12 million in the US right now, and less than 2 million are owner occupied. So less than a sixth. So this actually represents an incredibly powerful opportunity. You are able to live in one unit or multiple units if you're co-buying and so forth. That living in that unit, especially with the new Fannie program that was released at the end of 2024, allows you to get a primary home mortgage, which is a better rate, allows you to put as little as 5% down. The other thing that it does is, we showed the wage growth, over decades. Sometimes it feels, and I've heard this be said, like it feels like I need a second job to afford. One of the nice opportunities with purchasing a 2 to 4 unit building is that you actually get that second income or third income or fourth income from the rental income that's created, and that gets added. You're often buying the property at 20 to 30% less square foot, so than a single family home or a condo. So now you have that ability. So your rental income's offsetting and reducing your mortgage, also allowing you to borrow more. Um, and then you're building equity over time. This becomes, for a lot of folks, this is a very powerful starter home, right? For a lot of people. The other thing that I'll bring up is what I've loved is that when you have more owner occupied 2 to 4 unit buildings, there's a care for the neighborhood. A lot of the folks that we are actually, and I can give you a couple case studies that we can talk about that are not necessarily in the white paper, but we're actually helping folks who are renting in those buildings buy the buildings from the owners oftentimes as well, right? So there are people who already live and want to stay in that neighborhood, want to stay in that place, and want to give back, right? And so, it's gone as high as 40% of our folks to now I think we're at around 33, 35% or so are purchasing these multifamily properties. But it just becomes an incredible way to be almost a small business owner and a homeowner at the same time. And we even have folks who will have the building managed, use a local property manager, support the local businesses as well. And this can be pretty transformational. I do think it represents on the demand and buy side one of the biggest opportunities to put in play.
And then finally, rent vesting before we move on to the amazing questions that are showing up in the chat.
Yeah, so rent vesting is, I know at one point we called it second home is the first time buying or the shift mentality. And this is an example. I don't know if we can go to the next slide, but this is an example of where you might be priced out of the place that you're living. And we give the example of Selena and Wade, who couldn't necessarily afford Brooklyn. They're hitting that, to that first time meeting buying age, that 40-year-old mark, right? And they're saying like, hey, I just really want to finally own. And so they started with a property in Hudson Valley. They feel like homeowners. They finally made that. They have equity in a real property, and they're getting advantages from that. They're also partially renting it out to help sustain the property, and ultimately building equity so they will be able to buy. So, my own co-founder at Nestment was like, the two places I've grown up, San Diego, and then where I live now, San Francisco, I'm not going to be able to afford for a while. So he also, went this path and said, I'd like to buy something first that I can kind of grow equity over time. And so it becomes a way where, you don't have to necessarily leave that job market where you are. Obviously, we want to think about what are the consequences of kind of that movement of money. But it also strengthens, again, the local businesses and so forth. And we have about a fifth or so of our folks who go down this path. Um, and I think the last thing I'll say, whether it's co-buying, whether it's rent vesting, or whether it's house hacking, one of the things that, and you all talked about it in the shared equity piece, that I really, really want to put forward is to start to look at home equity almost as its own currency, a very unique currency. So, you know, it's almost like having a type of currency that at different points can be liquid and you can exchange for cash, but it gets you a roof over your head. It gets you a tax write-off in a way that a lot of other currency or capital doesn't. And it provides that emotional, physical, and financial stability of four walls and a roof for you and your family. So what we're starting to see is a lot of folks starting younger. In fact, we have a ton of folks graduating from college and either saying, hey, I want to own with my roommate that I've already lived with for 4 years, or hey, maybe I need to start because I don't know if I'll be able to afford if I don't start with something like rent vesting first.
So in these last few minutes, thank you, Niles. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to try and get into the questions here. Jeremy's already started digging in the chat and answered, typing them out. We're going to do our best to get through the ones that aren't typed out. And if there's follow-up opportunity, we will do that. So starting with anonymous attendee, is the current housing market overweighted with home ownership in many countries? Rental accompanies prosperity. Here, the emphasis on home ownership may have removed us toward untenable wealth disparities. Jeremy, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is the cascading effects that we're trying to create for this housing gridlock. So we know in many markets, market rate rent is also skyrocketing and pushing that kind of monthly cash flow battle into an untenable spot. So the thought here is, how do we create more, well, first of all, units ideally in a particular area, but these owner occupied units that Niles just laid out, or having investors in single family properties like rent vesting, where they're not trying to make some 10-year return. They're not trying to make some investor market based return. They're just trying to offset their housing commitment for each month or get in the game from an equity position. So really what we think is this can have a positive effect on the rental community as well. So we're not saying, as you heard in rent vesting, that there isn't a spot for first-time homebuyers to rent and own some equity, or actually build a market where market rate rents stabilize because of house hacking or these other things. So I actually think when we outline the continuum, that's the benefit that we saw to the rental community as well.
Wonderful. And Jeremy, you did touch on this a little bit in your remarks, but if we can respond more directly to Melinda about shared equity and its relation to the HELOC alternative.
Yep, we're seeing this growing market, and there have been some questions about what does a shared equity investor look like? Who are these private investors? And what we're saying here is home ownership, and actually just ownership, is an economic engine. It's an economic engine for communities and for individuals. I think if you're on this webinar, you likely believe that too. So we're seeing private investors, particularly private investors with a geography they care about, getting into the community because they understand we're going to generate more customers for our businesses. We're going to generate more economic growth for our town if we create these stabilizing forces. So private investors are no longer just looking at it on a spreadsheet as, what do I get as my return? They're actually looking a little more holistically, and we hope to continue to expand that aperture so that they're investing in the community because they see it as having benefits to their business in some other way in the community as well. So it's a combination, but it is not the buying equity from existing homeowners yet. That stands aside. Someday they might be together as an investable instrument. Today, two separate investors at purchase versus homeowners.
So in these final 2 minutes, I am going to address two questions and then send it over to Sarah. Well, one question and then the other we'll send to Sarah. So Bill asked, comments that adding manufactured housing and ADUs can expand the house hacking options. And amazing, spoiler alert, you're absolutely right. And this is we will be coming out with a partner white paper in the coming month. That is this. Well, this white paper is related to the housing finance side of things. The accompanying white paper will be related to the supply side of things. And you are absolutely correct.
Can I say, Chrissy, we have
Yeah.
a number of great case studies of actually younger buyers starting by buying or living in the ADU and renting out the house, which is interesting, or multi-generational. So I'm excited that Bill brought that up.
Yeah, we're ADUs, accessory dwelling units, sometimes known as uh, granny flats, mother-in-law suites. I don't know, English basements, depending on where you are, they all have different terminology, but there is a lot of opportunity in this space, and we will be looking at how it links to the housing finance opportunities that we discussed today and in this white paper in that follow-up. The other question that I will close with, I will send over to Sarah, where Nancy asked, how can I save this chat? So, Sarah, if you want to give a little bit more info on next steps for how people want to stay engaged with the PAN, where this will be made available, so on and so forth. Thank you for your time, everyone.
What a phenomenal conversation. Thank you, Chrissy, Niles, Jeremy, for leading us through all of the findings. And we're so excited to be able to share the full white paper with the case studies that were mentioned, the data that was mentioned. And so a few things that we want to close out with in terms of next steps and staying connected. That question about the chat, yes, these questions are too good to stay in this room. So absolutely, we want to amplify what's coming up for you, how we can continue to engage and get those answers to you. We wanted to close out with two quick tasks. One is a poll that you see on the screen now around those different entry pathways to first-time home buying. What are you seeing? Maybe there are trends that you're noticing that were amplified here. Maybe you're not sure yet and not seeing these as common in your work yet. More to come on that. We'll keep that poll open with some next steps as a closeout of our session. We've got the complete white paper coming very soon this week that we'll be able to share not only as a follow-up email, but also in our Prosperity Action Network. So the best way to stay connected, access the slides afterwards, access the recording, and stay connected to ongoing research is by joining our Prosperity Action Network. You'll see a link in the chat that's just come up. It'll take you to the sign up page. Once you're in, you'll see the housing and home ownership section. You'll also see tax opportunity represented, child and family support, entrepreneurship, where we're sharing these practitioner-focused resources to amplify the work that's being done in all of your regions and all of your areas and the way that we can solve for these new pathways together. So with that, I will end the poll. I can see where we are seeing trends. More to come, a follow-up email with the recording, with all of the details and those great questions. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that we see you in our next conversation.